The parking space wasn't even that crooked, maybe 6 inches over the line, but the young man in the BMW saw an opportunity. He slammed his door and marched over, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Hey, old man, learn how to park." The 78-year-old behind the wheel of the beaten Honda Civic didn't respond immediately. His weathered hand stayed on the steering wheel, knuckles white with the kind of tension that comes from decades of holding back. "Are you deaf?" I said, "Move your piece of junk." The younger man's voice grew louder, attracting attention from other shoppers entering the grocery store. Harold Mitchell finally turned off the engine. His movements were deliberate, careful. Age had bent his shoulders and stolen some of his height, but there was something in the way he carried himself. Something the screaming man couldn't see. Something none of the gathering crowd could recognize. "I'm sorry," Harold said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can move it." But sorry wasn't enough for the BMW driver. "You people shouldn't even be driving. Look at this parking job. This is exactly what's wrong with—" The insults continued. Each word landed like a physical blow, but Harold absorbed them in silence. A small crowd had formed. Phone cameras emerged. Some recorded, others just watched with the morbid fascination that comes with witnessing public humiliation. Not one person stepped forward. Not one voice rose in defense of the elderly man who stood there, taking abuse for a parking space that was barely out of line. The BMW driver was warming up now, encouraged by his audience. "People like you are why insurance rates are through the roof. Get off the road before you kill someone." Harold's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. If you knew what to look for, you might have noticed the way his feet shifted into a different stance. The way his breathing changed. The way his eyes scanned the crowd with the methodical precision of someone trained to assess threats and calculate responses. But these people didn't know what to look for. They saw only an old man in a worn jacket, being publicly dressed down for a minor parking infraction. They had no idea who they were screaming at. The verbal assault continued for 3 more minutes. 3 minutes of public humiliation that cut deeper than any physical wound. When the BMW driver finally ran out of steam, Harold simply nodded, got back in his car, and repositioned it perfectly within the lines. The crowd dispersed, already, moving on to their shopping lists and daily routines. The show was over, but what they had witnessed wasn't just a parking dispute. It was a moment that revealed everything wrong with how we treat our elders, how we dismiss the quiet dignity of those who have given more than we could ever imagine. As Harold walked toward the store entrance, his gait steady despite his years, none of those people could have guessed the truth. This wasn't just any old man. This wasn't some retiree who had spent his life in an office cubicle or behind a factory machine. This was Harold Mitchell, the man who had trained the most elite rescue specialists in the country. The same Harold Mitchell whose students had saved lives in situations so dangerous that most people couldn't even imagine them. The same Harold whose expertise had been called upon during the most critical rescue operation in the city's history. If you believe that dignity doesn't disappear with age, that respect should be earned by character, not determined by appearance. Hit that like button and subscribe. Because some uniforms may come off, but the heart of a hero never retires. And Harold's story is about to prove that in ways that will leave you speechless. 3 years ago, when Mayor Patricia Williams found herself trapped in the collapsed downtown office building during what would later be called the Riverside District disaster, it was Harold's training methods that saved her life. Not that Harold was there personally, of course. At 75, his days of rappelling down elevator shafts were long behind him. But every technique used in that rescue, every calculated risk that paid off, every split-second decision that meant the difference between life and death, all of it traced back to a training facility 40 miles outside the city, where Harold Mitchell had spent 37 years creating the finest rescue specialists the state had ever seen. But here's what's going to surprise you about Harold's story. It's not just about one heroic moment or one dramatic rescue. It's about a lifetime of quiet preparation, of training others to be heroes when he couldn't be one himself anymore. And it's about how a man who dedicated his entire career to saving lives could be treated like a pariah in a grocery store parking lot by people who had never contributed a fraction of what he had given to his community. Harold had always been different. Even as a young man, he possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. When others panicked, Harold calculated. When others froze, Harold moved. When others gave up, Harold found another way. These weren't qualities he learned in textbooks or picked up from motivational seminars. They were forged in the crucible of real experience, refined through decades of facing situations where failure meant death and success meant someone's child came home alive. The grocery store incident wasn't the first time Harold had been dismissed because of his age. It happened more and more these days. Store clerks who spoke to him like he was mentally impaired. Cashiers who lost patience when he took an extra moment to count his change. Younger drivers who honked and gestured when he didn't accelerate fast enough at green lights. Each incident chipped away at something inside him, not because of wounded pride, but because of what it revealed about society's blindness to the value of experience and wisdom. That morning, as Harold walked through the grocery store aisles, his mind wasn't on the humiliation he had just endured. Instead, he was thinking about Sarah. His wife of 53 years had passed away 8 months earlier, and grocery shopping was still one of those mundane tasks that highlighted her absence. Sarah had always been the one to make the lists, to remember which brand of olive oil they preferred, to know exactly how many onions they needed for the week. Without her, Harold moved through the store like a man navigating unfamiliar territory, even though he had been shopping at this same location for over 2 decades. But something was about to happen that would transform Harold from an invisible old man into the center of a story that would remind everyone watching exactly why we should never judge someone by their appearance or assume we know anything about their past based on their present circumstances. What Harold didn't know, as he carefully selected tomatoes and debated between 2 brands of bread, was that the mayor he had helped save 3 years earlier was about to walk into that same grocery store. And when she saw him, when she recognized the man whose training had literally saved her life, everything was about to change. But the real shock wasn't going to be her recognition of Harold. The real shock was going to be what happened when word spread about who had been publicly humiliated in the parking lot less than an hour earlier. You see, heroes don't always look like what we expect. They don't always wear capes or carry badges or drive emergency vehicles with flashing lights. Sometimes they're elderly men in worn jackets who park slightly crooked and endure public abuse with the kind of quiet dignity that can only come from a lifetime of service to others. Sometimes they're the invisible ones, the forgotten ones, the ones we dismiss without ever knowing their story. And Harold Mitchell's story was about to become impossible to ignore. Mayor Patricia Williams almost didn't recognize him at first. 3 years had aged Harold more than she expected, and seeing him in civilian clothes, hunched slightly over a shopping cart, was jarringly different from her memories of their brief interaction after the rescue. But there was something unmistakable about his bearing, even diminished by age. Something in the way he moved with purpose despite his obvious physical limitations. Something that triggered her memory of that terrible day when her world had literally come crashing down around her. The Riverside District collapse had been the kind of disaster that defines a mayor's legacy. A combination of structural failure, human error, and catastrophically bad timing had turned what should have been a routine building inspection into a death trap. When the 3rd and 4th floors of the Patterson building pancaked into the 2nd floor, Mayor Williams found herself trapped in a pocket of debris with 2 city employees and a construction supervisor. The air was thick with dust and the constant threat of further collapse. Conventional rescue methods would have taken too long and risked bringing down what remained of the structure. That's when the call went out to the state's most elite rescue team, and every member of that team had trained under Harold Mitchell. Every rappelling technique they used to access the collapse site, every method they employed to stabilize debris while extracting victims, every communication protocol that kept the rescue coordinated and efficient. All of it had been drilled into them by the man who was now standing in aisle 7, trying to decide between 2 brands of pasta sauce. What made Harold's training program legendary wasn't just its effectiveness. It was the way he prepared his students for the psychological demands of rescue work. Harold understood that technical skills could only take you so far. When you're dangling from a rope in a collapsed building, when every sound could signal another cave-in. When you're literally holding someone's life in your hands, mental preparation becomes just as important as physical capability. Harold's students were trained not just to execute rescues, but to make life or death decisions under unimaginable pressure. The rescue of Mayor Williams had required exactly that kind of decision-making. When the team reached her location, they discovered that extracting her would require removing a support beam that was holding up a precarious section of debris. Move it wrong and everyone dies. Leave it in place and she dies slowly from internal injuries that were already critical. Harold's lead student, Captain Maria Santos, made the call to attempt the extraction. Her technique, her timing, her ability to coordinate 3 other rescue specialists in a space barely large enough for one person. All of it came directly from Harold's training. The operation took 6 hours. 6 hours of millimeter-precise movements, of calculated risks, of split-second decisions that balanced probability against possibility. When Mayor Williams was finally pulled from the wreckage, conscious and alive, it represented the pinnacle of everything Harold had taught his students about turning impossible situations into successful rescues. The media coverage focused on the heroic rescue team, and rightfully so. But none of those reporters knew about the man who had spent 4 decades preparing those rescuers for exactly that kind of challenge. Harold knew about the successful rescue, of course. Captain Santos had called him personally to let him know that his training had made the difference. But Harold's satisfaction came not from recognition, but from knowing that his life's work had served its purpose. Someone was alive because of knowledge he had passed on. Someone's family was intact because of techniques he had developed and refined. Someone's future was possible because of preparation he had insisted upon. Standing in that grocery store, watching Harold compare pasta sauce prices with the careful attention of someone living on a fixed income, Mayor Williams felt a profound sense of obligation. This man's expertise had saved her life, yet he was shopping alone, aging alone, apparently invisible to a world that had already moved on from his contributions. She approached carefully, not wanting to startle him or create an awkward situation. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful moments come from the simplest gestures of recognition and respect. "Excuse me," Mayor Williams said softly, positioning herself where Harold could see her clearly. "Are you Harold Mitchell?" Harold looked up, and for a moment, confusion flickered across his features. Then recognition dawned, followed immediately by something that looked like embarrassment. Here was the mayor of the city, impeccably dressed and clearly in the middle of her own shopping, and he was just an old man trying to stretch his grocery budget to last the month. "Yes, ma'am," Harold replied, his voice carrying the automatic respect of someone from a generation that understood hierarchy and courtesy. "I didn't expect to see you here." Mayor Williams smiled, but there was something deeper than politeness in her expression. There was genuine emotion, the kind that comes from unexpectedly encountering someone who has profoundly impacted your life. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully because it's important." Harold set down the pasta sauce he had been examining and gave her his full attention. 3 years ago, when I was trapped in the Patterson building collapse, the rescue team that saved my life was trained by you. Every technique they used, every decision they made, every skill that kept me alive in that debris, it all came from your program. Harold's response was immediate and characteristically humble. "Those were good people, ma'am. They did excellent work." But Mayor Williams wasn't finished. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't think you understand. Captain Santos told me afterward that without your training methods, that rescue would have been impossible. She said you had prepared them for exactly that kind of situation. You didn't just train rescue specialists. You created heroes." What happened in the next few minutes would transform not just Harold's day, but his understanding of his own legacy, because Mayor Williams wasn't content to simply express her gratitude privately. She was about to do something that would ensure Harold Mitchell's story reached far beyond the confines of a grocery store conversation. And the people who had witnessed his humiliation in the parking lot were about to learn exactly who they had been watching get torn down by some stranger's impatience and cruelty. The conversation between Harold and Mayor Williams lasted 20 minutes, right there in aisle 7 between the pasta sauce and the canned vegetables. Other shoppers began to notice. not because they recognized either person, but because there was something unmistakably significant about their interaction. Mayor Williams wasn't just being polite or making small talk. She was speaking with the intensity of someone expressing something that had been weighing on her heart for years. "Mr. Mitchell, I've thought about you many times since that day," she continued. "I've wondered if you knew how directly your work contributed to saving my life. I've wondered if anyone had ever properly thanked you for dedicating your career to preparing people for situations that most of us never have to face." Harold shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the focus of such direct appreciation. His generation had been taught that service was its own reward, that recognition was less important than results. But Mayor Williams wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone and, before Harold could object, began recording a video. "This is Harold Mitchell," she said, speaking directly into the camera while keeping Harold in the frame. "Mr. Mitchell trained the rescue team that saved my life during the Riverside District collapse 3 years ago. His expertise, his methods, his decades of preparing emergency responders for impossible situations, that's what made the difference between my surviving that disaster and becoming another casualty." Harold tried to wave away the camera, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. But Mayor Williams persisted. "I want everyone to know that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry badges. Sometimes they're retired trainers shopping for groceries, invisible to a world that has already forgotten their contributions. Mr. Mitchell, you saved my life just as surely as if you had been there yourself, pulling me from that debris, the bomb." Video was brief, maybe 90 seconds, but it captured something powerful about recognition, respect, and the way we overlook the extraordinary people living ordinary lives all around us. Mayor Williams posted it to her social media accounts immediately, along with a caption that told Harold's story in more detail. Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of times. By the end of the day, thousands of people knew about Harold Mitchell and his role in one of the city's most dramatic rescue operations. But the real impact of that video wouldn't be measured in likes or shares. It would be measured in what happened. When people in the community, including some who had been in that grocery store parking lot earlier that morning, began to understand exactly who they had watched being publicly humiliated for a slightly crooked parking job. The story reached local television news by evening. The anchor led with the basic facts. Retired rescue trainer Harold Mitchell, whose students had saved the mayor's life, had been publicly berated in a grocery store parking lot by someone who didn't know his history. The report included security footage from the store's parking lot cameras showing the entire confrontation from beginning to end. Viewers could see Harold's quiet dignity in the face of verbal abuse. They could see the crowd of bystanders who chose to record rather than defend. They could see the contrast between Harold's humble response and his attacker's aggressive behavior. More importantly, they could see the story for what it really was. A perfect example of how we judge people based on appearances rather than character. How we dismiss the elderly as burdens rather than recognizing them as repositories of experience and wisdom. And how a society's treatment of its heroes reveals everything about its values. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The television station's phone lines lit up with viewers wanting to share their own stories about Harold. Former students who had trained under him called to describe his impact on their careers. Fellow veterans who had served with him decades earlier reached out to share memories of his character and dedication. Even people who had never met Harold but had been touched by his students' rescue work began to understand the ripple effects of one man's commitment to excellence in training others. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source, the young man who had done the yelling in the parking lot. Seeing himself on television, watching his own behavior broadcast to the entire city, forced him to confront what he had done in a way that private shame never could have accomplished. The power of Harold's story wasn't just in the dramatic rescue or the heroic training program. It was in the quiet dignity with which he had absorbed public humiliation, never once defending himself by revealing his impressive background, never once using his history to shut down his attacker. Harold had taken abuse from someone who didn't deserve to tie his shoes, and he had done it with the grace that comes from a lifetime of putting service above ego. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from preaching about respect and recognition, but from witnessing the stark contrast between how we treat people and who they actually are. Harold Mitchell was about to become a symbol, not just of unrecognized heroism, but of the dignity that defines true character. The young man's name was Derek Thompson, and by the time he saw himself on the evening news, his day had already been transformed by a growing sense of unease about his behavior in the parking lot. What had felt like justified frustration in the moment now looked like something much uglier when viewed from a distance. But seeing the news report about Harold's background didn't just make Derek uncomfortable, it made him physically sick with shame. Derek had always considered himself a decent person. He volunteered at his church occasionally, donated to charity when he could afford it, and generally tried to treat people with basic courtesy. But the parking lot incident had revealed something about himself that he didn't want to acknowledge, that his patience and kindness were conditional, extended only to people he deemed worthy of his respect. An elderly man driving an old car, struggling with a simple parking maneuver, hadn't qualified for basic human decency in Derek's mind. Watching the footage of his own behavior forced Derek to confront an uncomfortable truth. He hadn't just been impatient with Harold's parking. He had been dismissive of Harold as a person, making assumptions about his worth based on his age, his car, his apparent vulnerability. The verbal assault hadn't been about parking at all. It had been about Derek's belief that some people, particularly elderly people who moved too slowly, or drove too carefully, or took up too much space, were obstacles to be removed rather than human beings deserving of respect. The revelation about Harold's background made Derek's behavior even more mortifying, but it also offered him something unexpected, an opportunity for redemption that was as public as his shame had been. Derek spent the evening researching Harold's career, learning about the lives that had been saved by Harold's students, understanding the decades of service that had defined Harold's professional life. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Derek called the television station and asked to speak with the reporter who had covered the story. He wanted to make a public apology, not just to Harold personally, but to everyone who had witnessed his behavior and to everyone who might be inspired to treat their elders with more respect going forward. The reporter, recognizing the power of the story, arranged for Derek and Harold to meet publicly, with cameras rolling. The meeting took place 2 days later in the same grocery store parking lot where the original confrontation had occurred. Harold arrived quietly, driving the same Honda Civic, parking in the same general area. Derek arrived with visible nervousness, carrying a prepared statement but also bringing something more important: genuine remorse and a desire to make amends that went beyond mere public relations. "Mr. Mitchell," Derek began, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you an apology that's bigger than anything I can put into words. I treated you with disrespect and cruelty, and I did it based on assumptions that revealed everything wrong with my own character and nothing accurate about yours." Harold listened with the same quiet attention he had shown during the original confrontation, but this time there was no tension in his posture, no need to absorb hostility. Derek continued, speaking not just to Harold, but to the cameras and the growing crowd of onlookers. "I learned about your career, about the lives you've saved through your students, about the decades you spent training heroes. But even if I hadn't learned any of that, my behavior would still have been inexcusable. You don't have to be a hero to deserve basic human respect. You don't have to have saved lives to be treated with dignity. You just have to be a person, and I forgot that." The apology lasted several minutes, but its impact extended far beyond that parking lot. Derek's willingness to acknowledge his mistake publicly, to take responsibility for behavior that revealed his own character flaws, created a powerful counterpoint to the original incident. Here was someone choosing accountability over defensiveness, growth over pride, making amends over making excuses. Harold's response was characteristically gracious. "Son, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them and how we treat people going forward." But Harold also used the opportunity to address a larger issue. "This isn't really about me or about what I did in my career. This is about how we see each other, how we treat each other, especially those of us who might move a little slower or need a little more patience." The reconciliation between Derek and Harold became a story about redemption and forgiveness, but it also became something more, a demonstration of how individual moments of choice, choosing cruelty or kindness, choosing assumptions or curiosity, choosing dismissal or respect, create the character of entire communities. The story didn't end with the apology. Harold's newfound visibility led to invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and veterans organizations. His message was always the same, that service comes in many forms, that heroism is often invisible, and that the measure of a society can be found in how it treats those who have already given their best years to others. But Harold also used his platform to advocate for something bigger than personal recognition. There are Harold Mitchells in every community, he would tell his audiences. They're your retired teachers who shaped generations of children. They're your former firefighters who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. They're your military veterans who served in wars you've never heard of. They're your elderly neighbors who raised families and built communities and contributed more than you'll ever know. And they're all around you, invisible until you choose to see them. Harold's story became a catalyst for broader conversations about aging, respect, and the value of experience in a society obsessed with youth and speed. Schools began inviting elderly community members to share their stories. Local businesses started training employees to be more patient with older customers. The city launched a program recognizing the contributions of senior citizens who had played important roles in community development but had never received public acknowledgement. Derek Thompson became one of the program's most active volunteers, working to connect young people with elderly mentors and organizing events that celebrated the wisdom and experience of older community members. His transformation from someone who had publicly humiliated an elderly stranger to someone who dedicated his free time to honoring seniors became its own powerful story about the possibility for personal growth and redemption. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Harold's story was the way it changed how people saw each other in daily interactions. The parking lot incident had been captured on video and shared widely, but it hadn't been shared to shame Derek or celebrate Harold's patience. It had been shared to ask a simple question: how do we want to treat each other? And more importantly, what kind of community do we want to be? Harold continued shopping at the same grocery store, parking in the same general area, moving through his daily routines with the same quiet dignity he had always possessed. But something had changed in how people saw him, and more importantly, how they saw others like him. The elderly weren't just obstacles to be endured, but individuals with stories, contributions, and ongoing value to their communities. The lesson of Harold Mitchell's story wasn't that every elderly person is a secret hero, or that every act of disrespect targets someone with an impressive background. The lesson was simpler and more universal, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their age, appearance, or apparent circumstances. That patience and kindness cost nothing but reveal everything about character, that the way we treat our most vulnerable community members reflects our values as clearly as any policy or program. In a world that often moves too fast to notice the quiet contributions of those who have already given their best years to service, Harold's story became a reminder to slow down, pay attention, and recognize the extraordinary people living ordinary lives all around us. Heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they're just elderly men in grocery store parking lots, deserving of respect not because of what they've accomplished, but because of what they represent. A lifetime of service, sacrifice, and quiet dignity that demands recognition. Harold Mitchell never sought fame or recognition for his decades of training rescue specialists. He never promoted his own contributions or sought credit for his students' heroic achievements. He lived quietly, shopped carefully, and moved through the world with the understated grace of someone who had spent his life preparing others to be heroes when the moment demanded it. But his story became a powerful reminder that heroism takes many forms, that service often goes unrecognized, and that the measure of our character can be found in how we treat those who have already given more than we know. The next time you see an elderly person struggling with a simple task, moving slower than you'd prefer, or taking up space in ways that inconvenience your schedule, remember Harold Mitchell. Remember that you're looking at someone with a lifetime of experiences, contributions, and stories that you couldn't imagine. Remember that patience and respect cost nothing but reveal everything about who you are. And remember that in a world that often forgets the value of those who have already served their time. Choosing kindness over impatience, respect over dismissal, and curiosity over assumptions might be the most heroic thing you do all day. If Harold's story moved you, if it changed how you see the elderly people in your own community, share your thoughts in the comments below. Because the real heroes aren't always the ones making headlines. Sometimes they're the ones who trained the heroes, and they're standing right next to you, invisible until you choose to see them.